Good evening and welcome to a PoliticIt podcast. Tonight we have Bill Campbell. And, you're running for Congress,
Yes. CD1.
CD1. And what a great time, huh? Why don't I was thinking that this would be a good opportunity for people to know you and kind of where you're from and what your background is. And so let's start when you first went to work.
Okay. Thank you, Senator, for this opportunity. Yes, 31 years ago, my wife and I got married, and we moved to Ogden. Beautiful place just down the street at the Sunchase Apartments. We've been on a honeymoon since.
Oh, that's cool.
I went to work at Autoleave. Amy went to work in McKay-D, and it's been a fantastic community and experience since. I've been at Autoleave since. So many tremendous opportunities, great people, and you can see the company succeeded during that time.
So when you first started there, that was kind of a small startup in a way, wasn't it? Or it wasn't tiny, but
yes,
compared to the company you were coming from.
Yes, I started with KPMG. So yes, and then transitioned over. At that point, it was Morton Thiokol, and at the time of the split, they were splitting off an automotive safety products division. And they didn't have enough talent or resources because most persons thought there was more stability on the aerospace side. At that point, the automotive safety products didn't have any revenue, didn't have any customers, so it was a risky proposition. But you look at it now, it's a $3 billion organization, and right down the street, the best automotive safety company in the world. And there's a lot of great things in the community that deserve the credit for that.
Yeah. And so you started on the finance side, right? And accounting and finance and...
Yes. I started on the budget side, on the finance side, gradually progressed, and essentially for the last 20 years, I served as the CFO.
That's interesting. 20 years as a CFO.
Yes.
At one place.
At one place. It was a fantastic work environment with great people. And I did have such a wide variety of experiences. So even though my title was still the CFO, I got a chance to serve many other roles. I was also the vice president of supply chain management. I had some sales roles. I went off to establish some joint ventures and worked with a lot of our national and international partners.
So how do you think that experience would help you in Congress?
Because I think it's the same situation. We're starting off where we need to launch a lot of programs, and there's not a lot of clarity to begin with. So once you launch, you need the immediate feedback to be able to adjust to whatever the circumstances and whatever the metrics are providing. But in the same sense, it's developing the local relationships. We have such a fantastic relationship with the local universities on the academics, the community, so many local businesses, and they deserve as much credit for this success as the team at Autoleave.
Right.
And it's the same thing for the Congress role.
Uh-huh.
I think ultimately it's working with people, deciding who you want as partners and who you don't want as partners. But building that foundation of trust, building those win-win relationships, and then executing to the proper plan.
Yeah, that's the business way, right? It's, you think about that, that's business 101, right?
Yes, you know business very well,
yeah.
So I'm sure you'd appreciate the aspects. And it does require the trust of your partners there. And unfortunately, I believe that's something we started to lose on a national government basis.
Yeah, I think, you look at the situation in our economy right now, we've got a mess.
Yeah, unfortunately, a big mess. I believe the reading yesterday was inflation at 7.9%. And everyone I talked to, from up to Logan, Brigham City, Ogden, down through Davis County, and even Salt Lake, everyone's being negatively impacted by the inflation.
Yeah.
And the worst part is there are things we can definitely be doing as a government and as a community to mitigate those costs, but we're not taking those actions.
Yeah, that it's such a travesty. I think the initial stimulus, to come back from COVID, got things moving, but when you're at 2% unemployment, you can't be spending $1 trillion.
That's part of it. I'm the only candidate with a reduced inflation plan as part of the forecast, but part of that does involve reducing the demand. I think the current level of stimulus is unnecessary. You're right, with inflation so high, with the unemployment rate so low, the government continuing to spend trillions of dollars is just exacerbating the impact on the inflation basis. not to mention just running up more debt that we're going to have to pay the consequences for later. But that's a key part of the plan.
I just read yesterday that there's a plan now at the Fed to buy back a lot of the securities that they own, right? Yeah. Which basically means they're monetizing the debt, right? So you're trading cash for securities that you're going to sell out in the market. That seems like kind of inverse of what they should be doing.
I fully agree, and I believe your background's also an economist, right?
Yeah.
So you'd fully understand the impacts of the monetary policy. And I think the Fed initially responded well to the challenge, but we've left the programs on for far too long. And their current actions, I believe, are not helping the situation going forward.
So how do we fix that, in your opinion? What?
As part of the reduce inflation plan, we discussed the reducing the demand. The other part is obviously increasing the supply. And that goes everything from the energy basis to the labor supply to a lot of other categories. I did not fully like Biden's State of the Union plan, but there are two comments in there I did appreciate. The Make It in America and the Fund the Police. To make it in America, we need to increase the local capability. And by increasing the local capability, we'll increase the supply and help create the proper equilibrium with the supply and demand.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what else is part of what you would propose?
Yes, and we briefly discussed the other one because one of the other 5 principles involves a monetary policy. I do believe the Federal Reserve needs to raise interest rates. Because right now, to keep it simple versus the 10-year, inflation around 8%, 10-year at 2%, that's causing more of a demand stimulus. But unfortunately, they need to, because if we actually paid interest at the 8% inflationary rate off the $30 trillion in debt, that'd be $2.4 trillion annually, just in terms of the interest expense, more than half of what the government actually collects in. And the difficult part is it's impacting us every day, because the Federal Reserve is artificially keeping interest rates low. And by keeping it low, that means we're getting less in terms of CDs, savings accounts, banking accounts. So we're the ones that are subsidizing the lower rates just to keep them below that level.
Yeah, and with the inflationary pressure too, that's really eating into people who have any money in the markets, right?
Yes. So in some aspect, if we raise the rates, it will increase some of the borrowing costs, but also reward the savers for the interest income, and it'll help increase the value of the dollar, which will help mitigate some of the international demand, which should help us longer term.
It's to me, looking at what's going on from an economist standpoint, it just seems silly to me that people don't see that what they're doing is actually making things worse rather than making them better.
They are, and you see that when people gourd up for the holidays and build up the supplies. Yeah, their actions are, and especially the government policies, telling persons or funding persons so they don't need to come to work, or creating additional restrictions to make it harder for persons to work, is just increasing producer costs, which ultimately drive up inflation as well.
Right.
Because part of the policy also involves reduce the regulations. Because there's just far too many federal regulations that we need to eliminate in order to help businesses more successfully compete.
Yeah, it's funny. They're fairly fundamental things. And I think that's one area where you have a competitive advantage over the competitors in your race in terms of really understanding at a very simple level what's going on and what the problems are.
Because so many of it does involve following the money and how it's being impacted. As simple as I believe I saw a couple references from your side in the ESG issues.
Yeah.
And I fully support, we have an excellent state treasurer in Marlowe Oaks. And some of his comments on how ESG is negatively impacting us, both locally and our global competitiveness, I think are right on. So we need to follow some of those suggestions.
Yeah,
I think ESG has good intentions.
Right. Yeah, I was just going to say, let's explain that a little bit to people about what that is, the ESG investing that we're looking at right now. A lot of the.
Okay.
So the E, right, is energy, right?
Energy, environmental.
Yeah, environmental. How does this impact the environment? And what they're trying to say is you need to be responsible, right? And what does that really mean, right? And that, the S is the social part of it, and the G's the
governance.
The governance, right? Proper governance. And what does that mean? If you're not driven by market forces, what's driving things?
Because market forces, I'm a firm believer in capitalism. So I believe market forces do need to have a consideration. But I also see it not only on an individual and community basis, working for a global company, you see how the ESG policies are negatively affecting our competitiveness. Because it starts off with genuine intents. They come up, are you not concerned about the environment? Yes. Do you care about social issues? Yes. Do you care about governance and ethics? Yes. So everyone can agree on the three pure intentions.
Right.
They're good. But then when they take that and try to develop a scorecard, okay, now that you have admitted that, these are all the things that you need to do. And that's when they start to push social policies and other items, which once implemented puts us at a global disadvantage against companies in China, other places in Asia and Europe. So good intentions, but not being applied optimally.
Right. Yeah, because if we have one standard for our environmental policy and China has a different standard, that actually puts them at a competitive advantage to us, right?
And I think that's a perfect example, because not trying to get too divisive with the energy policy, but I believe we need to become more energy independent. I understand persons that want to protect the environment, but when you say you want to protect our environment and not allow local energy development, but in the same sense you're allowing imports from Russia and China to build coal as alternative energy sources, if you just allowed us, we have the cleaner sources than they do. So by shutting us down on the basis of ESG, you're actually opening up others' opportunities internationally that have a worse impact on the globe.
Yeah. And you know what? I don't think people understand that that's part of what's going on right now, right? This great reset that they talk about, but just that scoring by itself, why would we ever enter into an agreement that puts us at a competitive disadvantage?
And again, I believe you could trace it down to between the BlackRock references and Larry Fink and some of the other items. What it amounts to is some of the global investors are trying to promote those on the investor side. The difficult part is it started with the government. The government wanted to push certain policies, and they know they did not have the authority to do it. So there's other ways the government's starting to take money, print money actually, and use it to motivate certain causes, give it to businesses, reward them with contracts. Unfortunately, when the government shouldn't be involved in the first place, then printing money and incurring more debt in all of our names to promote those causes by promoting the businesses but require them to follow their policies in order to get the money as revenues. The money is being used inappropriately, and we're paying the price.
And that's not, I mean, I'm a big one on what is the proper role of government, right? Going back to the law, right, by Bastiat. I mean, you really read through that and you start to understand, the government is there to protect our rights, not to rule.
Exactly. The whole we the people, by the people, for the people. We definitely need to go ahead and push that because they have overreached their roles. And that's one of my primary responsibilities I like to see going forward, is constrain the government to stop that overreach, especially stopping the spending. And personally, I think a great example is if we go back to the midterms in 1994. If you remember, we had a Democratic president, Clinton.
Right.
There was a unhappiness, we'll just say, during that time, during the first 2 years, without going into details. There was a bit of a Republican revolution. Newt Gingrich came back with a contract for America. And that was the time that we stood up, reversed a lot of the negative policies. We took strong positions as conservatives to go ahead and push that. 2 years later, we finally had a balanced budget within the government. And we had the ability to start promoting the proper causes.
Right.
And to keep the government within their federalism roles.
Yeah, and thank goodness that Clinton saw the opportunity there, right? With Gingrich, he saw that was actually the right thing to do.
He did, and Clinton's moderate positions now would be viewed more as Republican positions if we did it in hindsight. But he did grasp those because he realized they were best for the nation, even though they were not purely Democratic.
Right.
Now, for the record, because I don't want a bunch of texts and emails afterwards, I did not vote for either of the Clintons.
Right.
But I, too, believe that Bill Clinton, during that time, did move more to the middle with Newt Gingrich and the Contract for America, and we were able to accomplish significant items in the mid-'90s.
Yeah, and sometime we need to get back to that sanity. You know, if you look at the Overton window, and that's really kind of a measure of where the middle was, right?
Yeah.
It's shifted so far to the left. Now we have this Green New Deal, which ESG is actually a vehicle to promote that, right?
That was a perfect example because AOC and others were pushing the Green New Deal. They were not able to get it across, which I was personally happy about. So in my opinion, ESG is just another route they're trying to go through the investor community and through businesses to try to enforce that. But
yeah, which you know, if you think about it, that's not right for America.
It's absolutely not right, and that's what needs to be stopped. And I personally get a little bit irritated when I realize how they're doing it. Is the government spending more and more money? They're taking financial incentives because they're producing money to motivate people along those lines between the investors and the businesses.
Yeah, and long term, that's, you know, one of the problems is these new modern monetary theorists have taken over the Fed. You know, you had Janet Yellen, and Janet Yellen, of course, her husband won the Nobel Prize for this, you know, new modern monetary theory, which is actually the new Keynesians, right? Their hypothesis is that you can spend all you want. It never hurts us as long as we're the default currency. But what happens when that gigs up?
Yes. And again, I would say it's not a risk. It's mitigated when we're a default currency. But obviously that's at risk right now because there's a lot of talk with regards to the energy independence. But we also need to be independent on the medical supplies. We realized that when COVID first came out. We need to be independent with regards to the food supplies. And in my opinion, we need to be financially independent because right now, spending in excess and relying on countries such as Russia, such as China, Japan, and other creditors for our money and to loan us is not a sustainable future. I do not want to be indebted myself to those countries, nor do I want my children to be indebted.
Yeah. And, you know, this inflation that's going on right now, it's another form of tax. But, you know, why are we spending, you know, close to $5 a gallon on gas? That's something that people get, right?
They fully understand it, and it's well beyond the gas. And unfortunately, I don't believe the situation is going to get better until we act properly. And by acting properly, having persons go on social media and criticize and tell us who to blame for those circumstances is not progressing the solutions. So we need pure actions.
So if you were in charge, okay, what is the solution to those?
I do believe we need to invest in innovations and new technologies. So I do support the research in terms of some cleaner activities going forward. But the reality is we are not ready for that today. So we do have some dependence that we need on coal, on oil, and the other energy resources. So we need to progress every option that we have until we have viable other solutions. My personal concern is if you go back to some of the tapes and the messages, whether or not higher gas prices and energy has been part of the plan as well. Because there were comments, I think it's Jennifer Granholm, the energy secretary, and I know her from Michigan.
Oh.
She was advocating it just needs to be cost competitive for the new technologies, and there's two ways to do that. Bring down the cost of the new technology and raise the cost of the existing technology. I personally am not happy in making clean energy more affordable by having to pay more at the gas station and for the heating bills.
Right.
I would have preferred continuing the current source, even if it involves burning some carbons, but also progressing the nuclear, solar, wind, what other options are available longer term.
That always surprises me that nuclear doesn't seem to be an option, especially now with these salt reactors and this new, you know, the new technologies they're developing.
But I think it is, because part of what they're doing just outside Salt Lake is starting to develop the new nuclear facility there, and possible nuclear energy source. And I believe in the Great Basin with the IPP, the Intermountain Power Project, that's a good future technology that we're going to have right in our state to help service some of the energy. So fantastic available solutions, and we need to invest in those going forward. but we should not withdraw the capability and the abundance of supply we have currently, because Americans shouldn't be paying the price for this change.
Yeah, that really hits home, right?
It does. It's hitting everyone's pocketbooks, both directly, as you and I were referencing what we pay at the gas station, and transportation and fuel costs affect food supply because of the transportation. It's a comprehensive cost throughout the system.
There seems to be a lot of vitriol in Washington right now, right? There's really wars going on that are beyond being comprehensible to me. How do we fix that? How do we mitigate those?
We definitely need to return to a level of civility. And unfortunately, right now, that is not being done. And in my opinion, it's actually getting worse with current affairs. One of the things I believe we need to do most is restore the trust. Because it's not just the persons between Washington that have the conflicts and the lack of trust. It's my neighbors, it's the community. You can go up and down the Wasatch Front, and there's distrust for whatever decisions are made. And part of it is some of the current politicians forcing us to take individual sides. I hear the comment often in terms of, if you're not with me, you're against me. No, those are not the only two options. There is honor and there is strength of character by saying, no, I'm not going to allow you to force me to take a side and then argue and criticize the other. And in terms of restoring the trust, in my opinion, that's going to be my first basis going to Washington, is unless we restore the trust, anything that we do out of Congress, anything that happens out of Washington is going to be viewed with skepticism. They're going to wonder whether or not the energy sources we're developing is because someone has an investment in a solar company. They're going to be wondering whether or not these pharmaceutical mandates and the masks were based upon somebody getting donations from a pharmaceutical company. They're going to ask whether or not involvement in Ukraine and Eastern Europe is based upon whether or not somebody has interests, either stock investments or donors, in a military contractor. And until those biases are removed, any decisions we make are going to be viewed with skepticism.
Yeah.
And we need to restore that trust.
Well, and I hate that those things end up being called capitalism, right?
Yes.
Because what's going on now is a system of cronyism, and it's something that really needs to end. We need to get businesses back more independent.
Yes, and it's not just businesses. I know you've been very supportive of UPU and the education and all the other changes. It's the government getting involved in those items. We have fantastic parents here, very passionate about their children getting the right education. And I believe if we just allowed it to be a local issue, which would federalism education
Right.
should be, we'd be so far better off. But unfortunately, the government's weighing a heavy hand in some of the decisions and the considerations in what to teach in the schools, what to promote as part of the programs.
And now part of this vitriol is generated by the fact that you've got these, state enterprises that have been set up, and now all of a sudden you step in the middle of that, and it kind of upsets people because.
Yes, and they have been stepping in. One of the main questions I've been receiving as I've gone up and down the streets here in northern Utah is, why are you running for this role? Why not as a mayor or city or county council? And the reality is, I think people at our local level are doing fantastic jobs at leading the state, including yourself and all the other legislators. What worries me is the federal influences when they're doing the overreaches and they're creating those semi-organizations to change our behaviors, to try to influence social policy. So part of what I see as my role is clearing the field, stopping that overreach, stopping their involvement, to let you and all the other great leaders we have here do your job that we know you're more than excellent at performing.
Well, and that is an issue, though, isn't it? Because Washington seems to be I don't know what you'd call it, a state unto themselves, or it just seems like all of the incentives that are being set up actually set us up, right?
Yes.
For failure.
For failure, yes. It's almost like they're trying to drive the issues to enable greater involvement, if I can just say that. Because it's, especially when you have an emergency, and if we consider COVID or the 2008 crisis, When they see that situation, in my opinion, they're using it as a chance to spend more money and promote other causes. My biggest concern is on the U.S. CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan and all those other items. They publicize it with great intentions, how they want to help. But only a small percentage of the money actually went for the good causes. So much other went for these other social purposes or these other preferred programs from their donors and other investors. And that's what we need to stop.
Yeah, we certainly don't need government. In fact, Bastiat talks about that quite a bit in the law, about how we set up these perverse incentives for people, and we end up promoting, picking winners and losers in marketplaces and other things. And that's it. Long term, I don't see that as a solution to anything.
I don't, because it's biasing the decisions going forward. Now, I do believe in the government investing more, but I would personally do, and this is part of the reduce inflation plan, is anytime the government has the patents, allow a royalty-free basis as long as the company is producing it in the U.S. to help them make it in America basis. That could help increase our local supply, reduce the cost, and extrapolate the benefits of the technology.
Yeah, absolutely. You know what? Let's take a break. You're watching PoliticIt, and we're here with Bill Campbell, candidate for CD1. We'll be right back.
I, William Campbell, am not accepting donations, and I commit to no personal stock trading. These actions are necessary because others have been profiting while we have been suffering and sacrificing. No more accepting donations from defense contractors than supporting military expansion. No more buying stock in a pharmaceutical company than supporting vaccine and mask mandates. Politicians' decisions should not be influenced by donations received or stocks owned. My priority is making your life better, not mine and not donors.
Welcome back. We're discussing things with Bill Campbell, candidate for CD1, the PoliticIt podcast. Bill, I had heard that you weren't taking donations. Can you kind of give me some idea as to why that is?
Yes, sir. And again, that's part of trying to restore the trust. Not accepting donations, committing to no personal stock trading, and no other corporate interests. So I've transitioned out of my role of auto leave. I'm not taking any donations because I want a clean, pure commitment to the people of auto leave. Unfortunately, I think in too many cases, persons go there, and when critical decisions are made, they're considering others' interests besides just the citizens in northern Utah and the American people. And if anyone can go into it as a clean process, not having any commitments to prior employers, not having any commitments to donors, and not operating on any self-interests where you may own stocks, I personally believe better decisions will be made.
Yeah, it's interesting. I sit down there in the Senate, and I don't know if you've noticed down at the Capitol, but the ceilings over the House and the Senate and the Supreme Court are actually glass.
Yeah.
And the idea behind that is that we believe in transparency, where you can look in and figure out what's going on. And I heard you talk about that once. What are you thinking in terms of transparency, and what's your thought pattern there as far as how you're going to govern?
There's a couple items in transparency, and it probably goes back to my corporate career, 35 years in business, that we were always held to a high level of visibility, that whatever you did, you had to assume was going to be reviewed by other persons, it was going to be made very visible, and especially as a publicly traded company, it was going to be under audit scrutiny the entire time. So I was always under a close microscope. And I believe to the extent we can do that more with the federal government, specifically with the Fair and Open Competition Act, I believe that also would help improve decision making. Because what that would entail with the fair and open competition is any of the decisions before we award large contracts would be made public, would be made visible, so everyone can see the basis of those contracts, who they're awarding them to, and why they were selected. Right now, too much of that is in the dark, which allows persons to bias it certain ways, potentially to donors, potentially to other parties, potentially to other interests, promoting causes that really don't represent our principles.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, we need more of that in government, don't we? And I guess that goes back to my idea that the government is instituted to protect our rights, not to rule us, right?
Exactly. And again, one of the items we're trying to push through, and maybe it's been in business for 35 years, but essentially, who is the customer? And again, on the business side, you always focus on fulfilling the customer's needs and making sure that the customer is right. In my opinion, the citizens in northern Utah, our neighbors, we should be the customers. But all too often, it's coming across as though the federal government thinks that they're the customer, and they could tell us what they mandate us to do, how much we need to pay for certain items, and how they go about caring about their business. And personally, if I had a supplier that wanted to make all the decisions for me, charge whatever they wanted, and preference their own interests and their donors' interests above serving the customer, it would be time to replace that supplier.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think what you're talking about are basic principles that seem like they're the thing to do, but why aren't they done?
And again, I have my personal opinions here.
Right.
But I think we have great people. If anything, in the last couple months, besides just appreciating the chance to talk to my neighbors even more, I've got a greater and greater respect for politicians. Because I know definitely not in it for the honor and the glory, because we get criticized far more than we get complimented, and under a high level of scrutiny. And everyone I've met during the process, good people in their hearts and good intentions. But something's happening when you take people with good intentions and good hearts and insert them into the process. And personally, I'm being critical of the process. I think the process that requires you to consider the interests of donors, where you're having to take care of other parties and these other interests, is resulting in less than optimal decision making.
So how do you go down that path then? How do you start? What do you do day one when you go into Congress?
Day one for me is trying to restore some of the trust and the civility with Congress. But also going there, I know it's difficult for any incoming freshman. That's why it's going to be easier to stop some of the programs first than start it. And I know I'm probably going to be unpopular, because anyone that's devoted money to a specific cause, specific donor, specific purpose, having that withdrawn is not going to be a favorable act. But I'm prepared to do it. If there's anything having to deal in a competitive industry like automotive for over 30 years, you have to make tough decisions. And you have to realize you're going to make some people unhappy. But I'm prepared to do that. So going in there and stopping some of the programs, but it's also going to signal why they're being stopped. And I think if we can identify some of the contracts and some of the spending, how they're being used to influence schools at a local level, how they're being told businesses need to incorporate certain policies that really don't represent the principles that we stand for. That'll help signal the proper principles that we want to follow while reducing the spending, thus reducing the deficit and the debt. But unfortunately, probably not making a lot of friends in the process.
Yeah, and that's when I first went into the Senate, people said, wait your turn, right? You have to kind of go along with the system, and I just thought, you know what, if that's what I'm here for, I don't want to be here, right?
Thank you.
You have to kind of say, wait, what's in the best interest of my neighbors, right?
Yes, I'm sure they're great people in Congress, just like they're great people in the legislature. But I'm not going there to make friends. I'm not going there to join a club. I'm going there to serve the interests of northern Utah. And right now, if you look at the principles we stand for, between family, faith, life, and liberty, unless some of our actions follow that or are in compliance with the federalism, no, I intend to stop the spending them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, we're in a bad state where the federal government, and that gets confusing because we really should call it the national government, because federalism is all about putting power to the states, right? Having a limited federal government, right? And then letting the other decisions be made as close as possible to the people.
And I trust the people. Just like I said, I trust the local politicians to make the decisions. I trust my neighbors, my colleagues to make the right decisions as well. And I'll give them credit. A lot of persons on the Democratic side, I truly believe they have good intentions. But I believe their intentions are coupled with the belief that they need to make the decisions for everyone, that they know what's best. And I personally don't support that proposition.
Yeah.
I believe giving people to choose the free will to make the choice and to exercise their freedoms. Because even with good intentions that Democrats may have there, 330 Americans, how can anyone sit there and make the best decision for all 330 Americans? Because we are different here in Utah versus the persons in San Francisco, New York, or up in North Dakota. The more we can allow the local decisions, the better.
Yeah.
And support the freedoms.
So what other policies are you looking at?
There's a couple other general principles besides restoring the trust. One of them I'm going to be advocating as a general one is solutions, not sacrifices. Unfortunately, I believe over the last couple decades, any time a situation or crisis has arisen, the discussion's been what sacrifices do we need to make? In order for the 2008-9 crisis, we need to take on this debt, we need to do the individual freedoms. After the September 11th incident, they had to do all the national security measures and the homeland security, we sacrifice a lot of freedoms now. With the COVID issue, they had to sacrifice a lot of freedoms on the medical care, on the records. And I do fear on the cyber side, I think we need to do more to protect our grid, for one, both on the IT side and the electrical grid and the entire power structures. But that stated, I think that could be used going forward as a chance to restrict our online behavior, lose some of our privacies there.
Yeah, and a couple of those things I've been thinking about a lot is just, you think about the havoc that COVID had on our economy. What if some rogue nation set off a nuclear blast above the U.S. and wiped out basically the whole grid infrastructure?
Yes.
I mean, we'd be set back 200 years.
Yeah, we need to protect against the EMPs. I believe Bob, for instance, is reinforcing that as part of the group, and I strongly support that.
Right.
Because that's part of the protections we should be managing against in those kind of local items. But what it amounts to is when situations arise, we do need a response to mitigate our negative impact. But then when the crisis is averted, we need to restore the freedoms. Unfortunately, there's been a power grab that when the crisis has arisen, they've used it as a chance to take away some of our rights, take away some of the freedoms, increase the spending, and then when crisis averted, they don't withdraw the programs. Those need to sunset, and we need to go back to the proper rights.
Yeah, when I look at things that are occurring right now, where people get mad in meetings and talking and try to be heard, and you hear those voices say, "We the people," right? And somehow that gets clouded to the politicians and thinking these guys are just trying to destroy the country.
Yeah. And that goes to the lack of trust. But unfortunately, the rhetoric does follow that. Because ultimately what we need are more on the results side, more on the actions, and less on the rhetoric. When a situation arises, whether it be Ukraine, the higher gas prices, seeing politicians go on social media and just tell us who to blame for individual circumstances and who's at fault and what the problem is, that's really not fixing it. We need the results that are actually going to improve the circumstance. I don't want to go on the news or watch Fox and find out, okay, now I know who to blame for this. I feel much better. I'm still going to go down the street and pay $4.50 a gallon for gas because it didn't fix anything. But thanks for telling me who I should blame for this.
Yeah.
No, fix the problem. Do your job. Anyway.
Yeah, and often a lot of those are caused by government trying to be involved in the first place.
Yes.
Right.
Because I think they're prompted for the response. So again, I'll give them credit for the good intentions. But a certain way you have to ask yourself, who amongst your team, and the team should not just be people at the federal level, they should be people at the state level, the local level, individual citizens. Who is the best person on your team to respond to those situations? And once the situation is resolved successfully, okay, restore it back to the prior way. Don't continue those restrictions or spending habits.
Right. Yeah. the old saying is never let a good crisis go to waste, right? And seems like we've been doing that.
We have been. And this is time for change it. But I believe there are some positive efforts. Just recently, for instance, the Postal Service reform. I don't know if you saw the news. I appreciate the Postal Service. 250 years providing mail, helping the communications. But it's a bit outdated these days. Just earlier this week, bipartisan efforts to restructure or reform the post office. Well overdue. Now the question is, they've dedicated a lot of money to go ahead and do that. Do you believe that money will be well spent? Or is that just a reason to I believe it was $59 million, to go ahead and award contracts, issue items to reform the post office? I think someone that's been in business for a while, gone through restructuring, had to reform to the market forces, would be the best people to apply as part of that process.
Yeah, one of the things I think about with that is Amazon's got in the business now of delivering packages. And,
Yes.
If you put your business hat on, why would they do that?
I think that's a perfect example. And that's why I support capitalism as well, because companies like Amazon do need to be cost competitive. They're not subsidized based upon whatever costs they incur, the taxpayer will just bail them out. No. Capitalism helps support the efficiency. It requires you to become efficient, to innovate and develop the most recent technologies. So the motivations are pure. And unfortunately, when you have a government agency that doesn't have the same constraints, that can just continue operating and get the funding, that is not the recipe for success.
Yeah, as having been involved in business, of course you outsource a lot of things that you do, right? Unless they get in the way of your end game, right?
But I believe that's the perfect recognition, because there are things that as a business you decide to outsource. And that's an honest assessment that says, I am not personally capable of doing this the best. If you are, sir, I'm going to give you the business.
Right.
You can help me. We can become partners. We can make this into a win-win situation. But if there's other interests and other decisions involved, then unfortunately the best decisions are not always proceeded.
It's interesting because if you think about that whole model, here you have a company that could say, okay, I could ship my packages through a system that is subsidized,
Yeah.
right? Which means it should actually be able to do it cheaper than I can, because someone else is paying part of the cost, right? But now you have them switching, because they need to get their packages there overnight, or
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's subsidized on the price side, so they help pay for the cost excesses. But any competitive business knows you need to control the cost. Like, we need to reduce the cost of the federal government, make the federal government more efficient. So it's not really a price equation. It's reducing the cost to become more efficient. And that's why part of the reduce inflation plan, in terms of reducing the regulations, if we can reduce the producer cost, we can help mitigate those impacts. And I believe that's one of the items that the post office, as an example, has not historically done.
Yeah, or they could provide this service cheaper, right? If that's all they do.
Yeah, and they could do it much better if they do it in an efficient way.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I think that example with Amazon is that even private companies that are geared towards doing that obviously can't do what Amazon wants them to do, right?
Yes.
Or why would they get in that business?
Yeah, that's why I believe Amazon's a great example. But it goes beyond that. If you follow how some of the capitalism has been progressing, the space exploration, when you see a lot of private companies now essentially competing against NASA and doing it better for some of the space trips and potential space travels.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Elon Musk and what he's done with SpaceX. I mean, a simple calculation. You say, how much does it cost per mission, per item, right?
Yes.
And it's amazing that in a short number of years, he's become a lot more competitive than the bureaucracy that we had behind it to begin with, right?
And I think that's part of it. It's supporting entrepreneurs and innovations like that, because that's how they've eventually succeeded and become more cost efficient. And if I can give a shout out to them along those lines too, and again, I don't want to get globally political, but when the Russians shut down some of the internet service and he stepped up and hooked up the satellite connections to restore some of the service, bravo, Elon.
Yeah, it's actually amazing, isn't it?
Yeah, an individual stepping up and reversing some of the tyranny acts of someone else to do justice, respect.
Yeah, way to go, huh? Yeah. You know, and you know, I can see the comments back to capitalism and stuff. Our students coming out of school think that it's a broken system, and I don't think they recognize that the broken part of it is having the government involved in it.
It is. I'm a firm believer in capitalism. A lot of it is based upon the free will, and you really need to make sure people do have the freedom of choice and don't have certain restrictions. But if you're able to ensure that, yes, capitalism is the best solution.
So let's go back just a second to your other plans that you have, because I think you've missed a few of them.
Yes, and again, the platform for the 4 items, again, making lives better. Because ultimately, I'm running because I want to make our children's lives better. The current direction of the country is making lives worse. And I personally believe I have the passion, the ability, and the situation to make Utah lives better. And there's 4 primary reasons that I'm focusing on. The first one's just safeguarding our children. I think there's a lot of great societies. UPU does it.
Yeah.
The focus on the education, the mandate in terms of the protections. There's so much being done along those lines. I would add reducing the debt burden we're placing on the children as part of it. But the second one, fortifying our financials. I believe a lot of the solutions we've incorporated have increased our debt burden and caused inappropriate, unnecessary spending. And that needs to be constrained, because anyone that continues to ring up a higher and higher credit card bill knows eventually you're going to need to pay the price for those decisions. And then we've been distracted for the last couple of years, and unfortunately, people haven't been paying attention to how high our credit card bill has been going. The third one, exemplifying our principles. Family, faith, life, and liberty. I think if we could just start each day by repeating and reminding ourselves that's truly what we want to focus on, we'd all be far better off. And I'm a firm believer in innovation. So I believe we need to innovate a lot of our solutions, whether it be on the medical side or to regain military superiority or to help the environment, a lot of the water issues. I know at the state legislature there's a lot of water preservation,
right,
conservation items. So there's a lot of ways technology can help along those lines. We already discussed some of them on the energy side.
Right. Well, you know what? It's been a pleasure getting to know you better. And I really want to do a shout out, and I hope that people watch this and get to know you better, right? Because sometimes these 60-second sound bites don't communicate what you've communicated today, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's why, Senator, I greatly appreciate this opportunity. I've just transitioned out of my prior job just a couple weeks ago, so I'm just finally starting to get a little more involved. Fortunately, I have been very active in the community for over 3 decades, not just in terms of the work with Autoleaf and, again, my wife and McKay-D in various places, but several charities, Habitat for Humanity, Special Olympics, CTC for the communities that care, coached so many sports teams, or kids went to school. That's why I have the highest respect for all the parents, teachers, and everyone else. Davis School District graduates, all of us are Aggies, which I'm sure you'd appreciate.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But that's why I have the highest respect for everything in our community. And I think we need to try to preserve these blessings as part of the next actions.
So if there's one last thing that you could say to people that are thinking about how they're going to cast their vote, especially people that are going to caucus, right? I mean, they went to their caucus meeting. Now they're going to go to the county convention.
Yes, the convention, obviously, on April 23rd is the key. So I'm in the process of trying to get everyone to know better, especially the 1,000 persons most informed. But if I can just speak on behalf of the entire community, yes, my goal is simply to make lives better. So if you agree that currently the country's headed in a less than desirable direction, I welcome we joining together to making lives better. Thank you.
Perfect. And we'll see you next week.